underway. My grand pleasure to introduce to you Dr. William, aka Bill Alnor. Give him a hand.
Thank you, Guy. It's real good to be here. My first experience with Roswell was last year at the conference, and wow, what an experience it is being here. It's amazing. So let me tell you, I'll start a little bit with my background. It's true that I spent much of my life as a journalist, a daily newspaper reporter in the Philadelphia region, but I also have written for much of what we call the evangelical press, Christianity Today, Moody Monthly, publications like that. I was also the news editor for a number of years for a journal called the Christian Research Journal in Southern California that was associated with the late Dr. Walter Martin, one of the 20th century's premier apologists. Now, an apologist is someone who doesn't apologize, that's only part of the topic, but an apologist defends the Christian faith. And so religion has always been a big part of my upbringing. My dad is a Methodist minister, so we would always have in our house all these arguments all the time about why we believe and what we believe and why we do it and things of that nature. And so, but yet I felt that, that I wanted to be a newspaper reporter, and I specifically wanted to write books. And so I'll just tell you a little bit more about what I'm doing, but I spent a lot of time, as I said, in the Philadelphia region as a reporter, covering crime news. I did a lot of investigations and things of that nature, and then I started teaching journalism at Temple University in Philadelphia. I'd won a number of press awards and things of that nature, and just with my bachelor's degree, I was teaching journalism courses, basic news writing courses and things of that nature. I didn't get serious about academia really until about 1995, when I realized that, they were asking me to teach more and more courses, and I really like to teach a lot of courses. And so I went to my department and I said, what do I need to do to teach here full time? And they said, you can't, not unless you get your terminal degrees. And so finally I've done it. They put me through the master's degree program in journalism and then the doctoral program. And then I gravitated down towards Texas A&M in Kingsville, where I direct the journalism program. So I enjoy teaching, but I guess my real passion is writing and research. I think investigative reporting is some of the most important kind of reporting that anyone can do. And during this conference, I've seen fine examples, I think, of some of our speakers doing good investigative reporting, including doing Freedom of Information Act requests and things of that nature. So I've done this in the world of religion. I don't want to be, I know that I'd like to think that I've got a good reputation in the evangelical press, but a lot of people out there don't like me because I dare to do muckraking exposés about Christians as well. So adding aliens to the agenda has been interesting, but I do think that much of what ufology is all about, or how the movement has gravitated, has gone extremely religious. And so a lot of you know that. Some of you that are veterans in the field know that all of a sudden we're talking about all kinds of spiritual things, not just the nuts and bolts ideas of UFOs. A lot of people talk about angels and all kinds of spiritual topics along with UFOs. And so I was the news editor of the Christian Research Journal, writing articles about different alternative religions, and I write, like as Guy said, my website is called cultlink.com. I got involved with the research of religious cults really in the late 1970s when a terrible event happened in Jonestown, Guyana. And of course that was the deaths of 913 people that were basically either shot or drank poison or were injected poison, cyanide specifically, all at the behest of a cult leader. And I began investigating other cult leaders, and so I've written about 500 different articles about religious cults. My work is widely cited in this particular area. Now I got involved again with the Christian Research Journal in the late 1980s, and I'll show you the article that kind of led to some of this. I was investigating what was known as something new in those days, and they used to call it the New Age movement. And it's not really that sensational anymore. In fact, I would argue that the New Age movement has become the prominent religion of America. More than 50% now of all Americans now believe in reincarnation. A lot of Americans believe in astrology, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and I can go on and on and on. This has become part of contemporary spirituality. And by the way, I reject all those things, but that's not really my topic for the day. But I was doing my news column for the Christian Research Journal, and I went to a festival in New York City. It was the Whole Life Expo. Some of you might be familiar with the Whole Life Expos. They still conduct them all over the United States, and I think in other countries as well. But I was rather astounded in 1987. I think it was 1988. I went to this Whole Life Expo in the Penta Hotel in New York City, and I realized that instead of talking about Shirley MacLaine and crystals and all kinds of weird New Age themes, of which I had been familiar with for quite some time, about a third of the speakers were talking about UFOs and contact with aliens. And so they were adding to that to their equation. And so I wrote this article, UFO Cults Are Flourishing in New Age Circles. Okay, and again, this is 1988, and the picture in this article is of Whitley Strieber. And 1988 was interesting in some ways because, and this is what I think thrust ufology, or rather the New Age, into the mainstream of ufology. In 1987, Whitley Strieber penned this book that it was a surprise bestseller. In fact, it says #1, the controversial New York Times bestseller up here. It was #1 of the New York Times bestseller list for 11 months in 1987. And basically, Whitley Strieber, who is and by the way, I consider Communion a very well-written book. So Whitley Strieber is an extremely gifted writer. And I read it, and it's quite compelling right after this Whole Life Expo convention. But he's a mainstream kind of like a horror writer. Of course, he was very well known before he wrote this book. But this was considered a nonfiction book. A lot of his other books were fiction books. This is considered a nonfiction book because it's his personal story of how he had been a lifelong abductee by aliens. But the rub is, and this is where it became New Age to a certain degree, he didn't call them aliens in the book. And I'm sure some of you have seen Whitley at different conferences and might have read this book. What did he call them? He called them the visitors. And where did he say they came from? Another world? Not necessarily. He said they might have come here on a plane to help humankind go to the next level of our consciousness. And he was one of their apostles that have chosen to talk about a new paradigm, a new religion. And so even the title sounds a little bit religious, doesn't it? Communion. And the idea was they wanted to have communion with humankind. The visitors were coming, and it was a very, very important time in the world, and they wanted us to have communion with them. And so I think it's personally speaking, a very dangerous book, because he basically tells you how to invite these entities, and he repeatedly says he doesn't know who they are and where they're from, and they did all kinds of things to him. They did these operations that we've heard about during this conference, and a lot of you are familiar with that. And they terrorized him. He almost had a nervous breakdown and things of that nature. But yet he tells us in this book to trust them totally. And so the New Age movement did exactly that. Everyone wanted to talk about aliens and UFOs from that point on. And really, ufology, has become a major portion of the New Age movement. Now, in my first book on UFOs in the New Age, I don't have any back at my table right now, but this came out in 1992. I talk about how the history of ufology, how it all developed since the modern era of UFOs began in 1947 when Kenneth Arnold spotted these silver discs flying above him in his private plane near Mount Rainier, Washington. But I also talk about how ufology in many ways has become big business. And of course, you all know what's the major industry arguably here in Roswell. Well, it's flying saucers. That's the major industry here. At least visibly it is. Now, I know it's a big dairy area, but in some circles, there's a lot of money to be made from UFOs. But Guy isn't making any money off UFOs, and different people aren't, things of that nature. But there is a lot of money. People are just fascinated by it. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm going to tell you about a number of other things, including from their own words. What are UFOs teaching? Is there an alien agenda? But the first thing I wanted to say, I think, is that, and it has a little bit to do with UFOs being big business. I wanted to put something on the overhead right now. In fact, I will. But this is a famous woodcut from my field. I'm in the communications field, and so my approach, again, is going to be different than some of the other speakers here today. I'm also coming from, I guess, partly a theological perspective as well, but I'm going to stick, as Guy said, to pretty much straight reporting. But this was a woodcut, and of course, photography really didn't begin in newspapers until the 1920s, and photography really didn't get real well known really until the Civil War. and we don't really have any photos before that time. It was a long time developing of things of that nature. But this woodcut, they used to put in newspapers illustrations. Artists would do things, and they had to engrave it in wood, and then put them on the presses, and then print the newspaper. But this was in probably New York City's most famous newspaper of all time, and it isn't the New York Times, now it may be, but this was in the New York Sun in 1835. And this is known as a great moon hoax. And this was front page in New York Sun. And basically what this is, and I know it's a little hard to see for some of you, but this is supposedly what an astronomer saw through a brand new telescope in Africa when he fixated the telescope on the moon. And again, it was a hoax all the way. But basically you have people flying around here with bat wings on. He called them bat people. And you have, if you look over here, you see a unicorn. And you find all kinds of strange creatures walking around and pools up there and things of that nature. And waterfalls. And basically, it was a sensational story, and it went on for days and days and days. And what happened? People flocked out from the New York City area and kept buying as many copies of New York Sun they could. They couldn't get enough of it. And so this is part of the lure of UFOs. And part of what I do, particularly in my field, mass media communications, is to study the effects of the media on society. By the way, my dissertation was on the role of plagiarism in religious formation and in the contemporary religious media. So that's another story in and of itself. So a lot of speakers here, and again, my approach is different in some ways because I do a lot of things. You know, my first book was on Bible prophecy, Soothsayers, the Second Advent. And then I wrote about UFOs in the New Age in my second book. And then my third one was on near-death experiences, which is by the way, very closely related to ufology. So there's a lot of parallels with the talk of angelology, near-death experiences, and so on and so forth. And then my latest book, which I have on my table, and I think it's in the front here, is UFO Cults in the New Millennium. And this really came out of my knowledge of cults and the fact that my first book on UFOs, I mentioned a little group known as a Bow and Peep UFO cult. You know, I devoted about 5 or 6 pages to it because they were kind of a footnote in the 60s and 70s. But that group later gravitated into becoming the infamous Heaven's Gate group. And so when they committed suicide in San Diego, 39 people killed themselves because they claimed that there's a flying saucer coming behind Hale-Bopp Comet, and they had to shed their containers, and they would wake up aboard a UFO. I wrote about that, but when I wrote about like the theological beliefs of the Heaven's Gate group, I was talked into doing a quickie book on other dangerous UFO cults. And this book, my latest one, talks about a number of UFO cults, and some of which have committed murder, and some of which are very, very dangerous. In fact, I consider all of them very dangerous. And I would not be surprised if there aren't more things like a Heaven's Gate disaster that happens sometime in the future. So that's a little bit where I'm coming from. But again, I think that ufology has become a major part of our culture, a major part of our society. But as a Christian, I was quite challenged by it. By the way, my 2 books in UFOs were published by Baker Bookhouse, which is one of the mainstream evangelical publishing houses. So I really, I pride myself in doing good research. My approach is different also from other speakers in this conference to a certain degree, is that I don't speculate very much. I'll just give you the facts. I think all the speculation I'm hearing during this conference is great. It's not fun hearing about that, but I'm not going to write about that kind of stuff. It's just too far out, and I'm not criticizing it either. But I'm saying that my approach is that of a journalist. I traveled in the commission of this first book on UFOs more than 20,000 miles. I hung out with all the contactees, all the UFO writers. I went to UFO conventions all over the United States, and that's the way I do work. I don't think that journalism, the state of journalism, is that good in the United States today, although it's better here than in most other countries, and that's one of the reasons I teach journalism. In fact, I direct the journalism program at Texas A&M in Kingsville, which is just south of Corpus Christi. It's too hot there, but I teach it there, and one of the reasons I feel challenged to teach journalism is that I feel that there's too much bias, that's gotten into the media today, and so I teach my students to pick someone they don't like and go interview them. I want to try to do what I can to make journalism better, and so that's kind of how I got involved in academia, and I'm enjoying South Texas, but I've lived in the Philadelphia region most of my life. But when we talk about the Great Moon Hoax, there's a lot of things that are interesting about it. I'll just read you a quote from a newspaper. It's a well-known magazine. I've got to dig it out here, but it's called the Smithsonian Magazine. That's a mainstream magazine, and they devoted a little bit of space one time to the Great Moon Hoax. And again, this is the most infamous hoax in journalism history. And the writer John Wiley says this: "Many people, I suspect, want the aliens to arrive for the sheer excitement and for the disruption of the routine of daily life. We have a history of yearning for alien life. The popular response today to movies about lovable or at least benign aliens seems a little different from the excitement of newspaper readers in 1835 over a phony report that Sir John W.F. Herschel had discovered bat-like people living on the moon. The hoax could not have lasted as long as it did unless people wanted to believe it." And I think that's a key, I think, of the UFO movement. People want to believe in this stuff, and I think we're intrigued by science fiction. And I'm very guilty of that myself, and I'm not saying there's anything bad with it. By the way, Guy said we all didn't have to come last night, the speakers here, so I went out to see Spider-Man. I thought it was great, But I like science fiction. I'm a Star Trek fan. I've never gone to a convention yet and put on Vulcan ears or anything of that nature, but I like this stuff. I think it's fascinating, and there's all kinds of things that we can speculate about outer space and things of that nature. But I think that there's something fascinating about UFOs and fascinating about outer space and fascinating about the whole realm of speculating on certain things. And this is one of the lures, and I might add this, one of the dangers, I think, of studying UFOs too much. And that's why I tend to be in the UFO movement, but yet I do a lot of other things on the side. I was a pastor of a Calvary Chapel in the eastern Pennsylvania area from 1996 to 2000. Again, I was a newspaper reporter, and I do all kinds of other things deliberately, because I think if you immerse yourself in this stuff all the time, it leads to a breakdown in your reasoning facilities. And again, I'm not saying this to disparage a UFO movement. I think it's fascinating, and I think what Guy is doing here is great. These conventions are really great. But sometimes people get way out of balance because this is their obsession. And that's part of, I think, the demonic element to, I think, the UFO movement in general. And again, I don't use that word lightly, and I'll tell you what I mean later, because I think that much of what the UFO movement is about spirituality. But the Bible also warns us in 1 Timothy 1:4, it talks about people that just get obsessed with following like rabbit trails, we would call them, or the Bible would say endless genealogies. And I think that some ufology can kind of lead into that kind of thinking. And also the book of Jeremiah talks about how the Israeli society at that point was obsessed with all kinds of conspiracies. And again, part of my doctoral work had to do with history, and it's amazing how many people were so obsessed with conspiracies and all kinds of ideas right prior to the American Revolution. And many of these conspiracies that people believed in were just not accurate at all. So I guess I'm kind of starting out with a warning to a certain degree about the dangers inherent, I think, with too much of an obsession with UFOs. But you could say that with anything. Another community that I really associate a lot with is the evangelical anti-cult movement. I speak at most of their conferences. I was the executive director in the mid-1990s of Evangelical Ministries to New Religions, and it's just a bunch of cult busters getting together. And I see the same kind of dangers in that field as well. Some people, they know everything about every false religious system. Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, Scientology, but they're not balanced with other parts of their lives. But to get back to what I was saying about the lure of UFOs is that a lot of it is driven by Hollywood, and we all know that. I definitely like science fiction, and anytime a science fiction movie comes out, I'm going to see it. But that's kind of the way I am anyway, since I do watch Society. And as I pointed out the other day, Spider-Man 2 opened up to the highest one-day gross of any opening in any movie history. And I thought it was better than Spider-Man 1, but what I have in my hand here is an internet site, and there's a bunch of them there that follow the entertainment industry. And this is entitled the Top 50 All-Time Highest Grossing Movies. And out of the top 10 movies, 8 of them are on science fiction, and a lot of them deal with UFOs. And out of the top 25 movies, a lot of them deal with UFOs. And so it's quite startling just how powerful this movement is. It's worked out for me to a certain degree, because when my first book, UFOs and New Age, came out, it quickly went into a second printing, because about the same time the X-Files came out on TV and sightings. And so there was a spike really in the mid-90s, early 90s over UFOs that's continued to this day. But of course, the number one movie of all time was Titanic. The number 2 movie is Star Wars. Okay, science fiction, about it's about aliens and things of that nature, put in a different perspective. E.T. was number 3. Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, number 4. Number 5, Spider-Man. Number 6, Jurassic Park. Number 7, The Lord of the Rings. And here's the second one wasn't UFO. Number 8 was Forrest Gump. So you have movies about fantasy, science fiction, UFOs, aliens, really among the top movies of all time. Number 14, in case you didn't know, is Independence Day. Number 16, The Empire Strikes Back. And some of the films that are among the top films in history are real close to science fiction themes. Such as Men in Black, by the way, is number 24. And Signs, number 34. I mean, that was about aliens. That was, and so you have really, and again, I'm illustrating the point, there's a lot of money to be made in UFOs. And you don't have to go very far from this particular hotel to see that, particularly here in Roswell, the UFO capital of the world. Okay, so I'm going to wind more into how I got involved with this, and I'll tell you what my conclusions are. And again, my conclusions are not speculative. I'm going to be citing these people word for word, line by line. And when I talk about these people, I'm talking about contactees. The reason I did this book, and of course it did stem out of my article, UFO Cults Are Flourishing in New Age Circles. Baker Bookhouse saw this article, and they were fascinated by it, and so they were really open to doing a major evangelical book on UFOs. And so I got a quick contract, and they gave me a cash advance, and it took me about 1.5 years to put this book together. And again, I did a lot of traveling and things of that nature. But my approach from the beginning was, I don't want to reinvent the wheel, because there's a lot of good UFO researchers out there. But when you start looking at UFOs from a religious perspective, what is the religious message? There was precious little written on the topic back at that particular time. But it's, again, the title, UFOs in the New Age, and then there's a subtitle, and this is kind of the key to my approach, at least with this. Extraterrestrial Messages and the Truth of Scripture. Now, I was telling this story the other day, but I'm almost 50 years old now. But when I was a kid, when there were tornadoes roaring through the American Midwest, we would hardly ever get a picture of it, right? Some of you are older and know that's true. Today, whenever there's a tornado that comes down, we get it on videotape almost every time. It's amazing, some of these recent shots on tornadoes. But back then, all we had was all these little fuzzy pictures. They didn't have video cameras. People would snap a shot of them on occasion and things of that nature. And I realized that since 1947 to the present, which again is considered the modern era of UFOs, the quality of photographs of UFOs hasn't changed at all. Where if you look at twisters, the quality has really gone up dramatically. So this illustrates to me, I think, the nebulous, meaning like fuzzy nature really of the whole phenomena. I wrote an article. See if I have it up here. It was for the SCP Journal. A lot of you might be familiar with the Spiritual Counterfeits Project at Berkeley, California. And I wrote 2 articles. They devoted a whole journal to this topic in the, the early 1990s. 1994, I think it came out. Alien Encounters, UFOs in the Realm of Shadows. And quickly in my research, I realized that UFOs in many, many ways is from the realm of shadows. We've heard stories, during this weekend, and again, I'm not going to rehash what other speakers have said, but some people didn't know they were abductees until much later. It had to be pulled out of their memories and things of that nature. It's part of the makeup, I think, of ufology in general. And it's almost like the X-Files. I'm sure a lot of you, being that you're here at a UFO convention, have been avid followers of the X-Files. Right when they find out, Scully and Mulder, they find out the evidence that really shows that UFOs are real, that aliens are real. What happens almost at the end of every show? It's frustrating, right? The evidence somehow vanishes. It's amazing, but that's really the way this phenomena is in many, many ways. And so I was mindful of that very, very early on in the research. And I said to myself, what do we have as a journalist that we can look at that no one can argue with? And I quickly came to the conclusion is that no one could argue with the fact, at least the claims, that people were receiving messages from aliens, right? I mean, no one can really argue with that. There's all kinds of books. You can go this weekend in Roswell to different people that claim that they've been told certain things by UFOs, and some of them have written them down. There's entire books written about channeled messages from outer space. and I'll cite some in just a minute. But I decided that, well, we have thousands of these messages, okay, that claim to have come from the so-called space brothers or the visitors, including some of what Whitley Strieber wrote in his book. We can at least put those to the test. And again, I'm a secular journalist, but again, I'm also a Christian. But I thought a good approach, especially writing for an evangelical publishing house, would be, how do these messages compare with Scripture? How does it really compare? I mean, is there something to this? Are we being told the truth from these space brothers? Just how does it compare with Scripture? Now, at a UFO, actually the Whole Life Expo in New York City back in 1988, I met Brad Steiger. I think a lot of you know who Brad Steiger is if you've been in this field for a while. He's definitely a New Ager, but he's written 110 books. And by the way, his real name is Eugene Olson, and he's from Iowa, but he's taken Brad Steiger on as a pen name. And it was interesting. I had conversations with him, and then I met with him again in San Diego, and I was covering a UFO conference out there as well. But he wrote a book that was one of the key books, I think, in that era of ufology. It was called The Fellowship. Okay, and basically he called it, this is the Space Brothers Apocrypha. And his approach was like mine to a certain degree. I mean, he does have a background as a journalist, but he went all over the world talking to contactees worldwide. And some of them had written down their messages that they allegedly had received through the Space Brothers. By the way, how do they receive these messages? Usually through telepathy, or usually through channeling, or things of that nature. And these methods, and I can tell you this as a longtime researcher of the occult, are not good. They're not to be relied upon, not to be trusted, and I think they're forbidden in the Bible under the term spiritism. Okay, so right away, these messages, I think, were suspect to me. And by the way, I've been to some channeling sessions in which, people were channeling space brothers and things of that nature. I don't endorse this for Christians to be involved with it, but I'm a journalist, so I'm not from Missouri, but I'm like, show me, I want to see what this is all about. And I talk about some of that in my first book on UFOs. But in Brad Steiger's book, and by the way, before I talk about his quote, in his I did give a summary conclusion in UFOs in the New Age over what my investigation, again, I saw this as a very careful investigation of the topic, and what my investigation has concluded. And this is what I've had to say about the UFO phenomena. And you'll find it may be a little interesting because I'm a conservative evangelical Christian, I really am. And a lot of conservative Christians have a knee-jerk reaction. They're going to say, oh, it's all of the devil. But I don't think it was that simple. Yeah, I do think it's demonic, but I don't think it's that simple. And here's what I had to say about it. The answer I will give you in these pages is that UFOs are real, that thousands of people around the world are receiving messages from them, and that these messages are forming the backbone of a new, powerful, New Age religion of universalism. You know what that is? Universalism is all paths lead to God, which, by the way, is opposite from Christianity, which Christianity claims that Christianity is the only way. Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. So universalism is what being taught is being taught through these messages. Let me go on a little bit further. A religion of universalism and fellowship with entities. Many identify as aliens. Everyone is welcome in this powerful new movement, they say, but their messages make apparent that not everyone is welcome, but only those who go along with their New Age plan. Now, back when I got started with this in the late 1980s, it wasn't just Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, that really made an impact. Also, that same year, in 1987, one of the major networks, I think it was NBC, decided to put a mini-series on. A lot of you might have seen that if you're following this topic this time. It was called Out on a Limb. It was Shirley MacLaine's story of her forays into occultism. It was kind of fascinating, and I'm very much a critic of what she has to say, but it's basically how she got involved in New Age occultism, and it talked about spirits and channeling and her guides and pyramids and astrology and Ouija boards. It gets into all these topics, and her spirit guides especially. And then at the very end, as she's in Peru, she's trying to figure out what has put all this together. And she looks up in the sky, and there's a big UFO that buzzed overhead. And then she kind of put it all together that UFOs are an integral part of this whole thing, the whole New Age. And so it was just Whitley Strieber's approach and also Shirley MacLaine's approach that brought it all together. And so since that point to this present day, you can see how like the New Age theology is very much tied in with much of ufology. Now, I'm not saying that all ufology is bad. I'm not saying that at all. We've had some speakers during this convention that talked about the Mutual UFO Network, and I was once a member of that network. I'm going to rejoin sometime in the near future, but they're all about studying this phenomena from a scientific perspective, and I think that's really good. And by the way, if you are involved with MUFON and try to bring in some channelers and start channeling aliens, you're going to hear about it from, and maybe even kicked out, okay, from the higher echelons of MUFON. Joe Jordan will tell you that and things of that nature. It's just not considered scientific, and it's not. You can't trust channeling. You can't trust astrology. You can't trust all these things. They've been proven false. And the only thing, from my perspective, spiritually, that you can trust is a real, well, is the Word of God, the Bible, but also a biblical prophet. A biblical prophet is never wrong. And in fact, Deuteronomy says that if one prophesies and it doesn't come to pass, take him out and stone him. So really, those are the things you can trust. You can't trust these New Age means of arriving at truth. And some of them are absolutely ridiculous. I was into the files of University of California at Santa Barbara, where Gordon Melton, the religion expert, works. He's also a ufologist. He does a lot of other things like me, but he was showing me some of these files and channeling in which there are people today that claim that Elvis is still alive. He's aboard a spaceship circling the planet Jupiter, and if you pay them money, you can get some of his channeled songs from outer space. That's how ridiculous it's gotten. You've been to some, I don't know, some of you might have been to some wacky UFO conventions, but people walk around with pyramids in their heads, and they'll sell these things for like $100 or whatever, even more today. So it's amazing just how people will believe anything, under the guise of religion. Okay, well, let me go further. Let me talk about, again, I mentioned Brad Steiger's book. He wrote a book called The Fellowship, and he summarized in the introductory chapter on the issue of, is there an alien agenda? Brad Steiger says, yes, there is an alien agenda. I say, yes, there is an alien agenda. But he kind of wrote it out, his summarization. Again, Brad Steiger is not a Christian. He told me in one of our talks, however, that he comes from an evangelical Christian background, but he kind of rejected that. But he does kind of consider himself a Christian, but he, as we'll see later, he redefines the term Christ, he redefines biblical terms and things of that nature. But he's, in putting forward a statement about what the contactees believe, and I'm sure you won't know who contactees are, the people that claim to be in touch with aliens, usually telepathically or other means, including automatic writing and things of this nature. And he told me what and he writes what the alien agenda is. And here's what he writes. Contactees have been told that the space beings hope to guide Earth to a period of great unification when all races will shun discriminatory separations and all of humankind will recognize its responsibility to every other life form existing on the planet. Sounds good so far, doesn't it? I love and peace and getting together. It's almost like what Jack Nicholson said in Invaders from Mars. Can't we all get along, And then he goes on to say this, and to me this really rung a bell, and I ran into this very, very early in my research, and it kind of frightened me a bit. And he said the space beings also seek to bring about a single solidified government which will conduct itself in spiritual principles and permit all of its citizens to grow constructively in love. And I began seeing from that point to the present that if you talk about alien messages, they do talk about a new world order, a one world government, leaping up to the next level, okay, the age of Aquarius, and pulling all of the world together under one kind of leadership. Now, why did this startle me a bit? Well, as an evangelical Christian, my first book, Soothsayers of the Second Advent, came out in 1989, had a foreword from the Los Angeles Times, the religion writer there, is that this rang a bell because of the fact of the book of Revelation, right? A lot of you might study, and Mike talked about this a little earlier, eschatology, the study of things to come. The Bible definitely teaches, okay, that there's going to be a time in the future called the tribulation time period, it's referred to, in which the world will be under a one world government. Okay, that will ultimately fall into the hands of a very, very evil man that Christians call the Antichrist. The Bible calls him the beast. Okay, and to me it was interesting that, and by the way, when you study Bible prophecy, you will find that the Bible talks about this many, many places, all the way back to the Old Testament and all through the New Testament. It's just not in the book of Revelation. And I'll be quoting a few scriptures a little bit later. But one thing is common about this new era. The Bible predicts about the dispersion of the Jews throughout the world. Okay, but it says at the end of time, okay, right before the time period of the tribulation, the Jews will suddenly return to their homeland. Now, did that happen, folks? Yeah. 1948, Israel became a nation again. So this kind of startled me. And in fact, it talked about how Israel in the latter times will be like a trembling stone, that every nation that comes up against it will find itself out in the cold. But it talks about a time period when all the nations of the world will be against Israel. Is that happening today? I think so. The United States still has support for Israel, but not many other places still do. And I might say this, I think our support for Israel has wavered quite a bit in the past 10 years or so. And so I think that this will continue. So I saw this. I began to look at UFO contactee literature in light of Bible prophecy, and I found it very, very interesting. Now, there's mention, Guy mentioned a little bit earlier, and again, a lot of my work has been on UFO cults. We talked about the Raelian movement a little while ago. That's the famous group that is trying to clone human beings. And by the way, I think that's a big hoax. There's a lot of hoaxes going on in UFO circles, and especially UFO cults. But in studying the literature of the Raelian movement, and I talked to these people in New York City and things of that nature, and I'll read you a few quotes from what they have to say. Well, I don't have it right here, but they talk about, let me see real quickly, I think I do have this here, but they talked about how the number 666 doesn't represent an Antichrist leader, as the Bible says it does, and the Raelians talk about how they need to get 144,000 people together. Where does this come from? The 144,000, and again, I'm not going to go too far into Bible prophecy right now. That's one of the themes of next year's conferences here. But 144,000 are a number of Jews that will surface during the tribulation time period that will begin preaching the gospel of Christ. And I find that so many UFO groups feel that they're part of the 144,000. Also, Brad Steiger, who I just quoted, talks about the 144,000. Okay, he says this, and this is from one of his books. I have it in my footnotes. I'm not sure which one of his books it is. But he talks about, he says, in this forthcoming spiritual cycle on earth, man is to experience the second coming. Okay, mankind should do everything in its power to move into the new age. And then Brad Steiger says this, one of these greater things is for a minimum of 144,000 in Christ consciousness and in their lighter etheric bodies to help lift and transmute earth and all forms upon it, including mankind, from the third dimensional frequency, physical matter, he says, into the fourth dimensional frequency form, which he talks about, the spiritual form of light body, which Jesus demonstrated after his crucifixion. Now, this really concerned me because, first of all, he's tampering with the 144,000 concept in the book of Revelation. Who are the 144,000? The Bible clearly says who they will be, 12,000 Jews from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, equaling 144,000. Now, he's changing this and not making them Jews anymore. But what he also changes here is that the resurrection of Jesus Christ. He claims that when Jesus Christ was resurrected from the grave, that he became a light body. Okay, which is a serious issue, folks. I think anyone that begins to tamper with the resurrection of Christ is in great spiritual danger. And I've been praying for Brad Steiger ever since I got to know him. I haven't talked to him in a number of years, but he's tampering with the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ. Paul said that if the resurrection hadn't happened, our hope would have been in vain. And that's one of the things that Paul says about it. But also, he's warping the idea of the second coming of Christ. The very, very last thing that Jesus Christ said when he would return is that he would return in the same way he left. And how is that? From the sky. I mean, he ascended into heaven, and he's going to come back in the same way. In fact, during Jesus' trial, he was very muted about what he said. He really didn't defend himself very much, but at one point he says, yes, and you'll see me coming with the clouds of heaven in glory, is what he said when they asked him if he is really the Son of Man or the Son of God. And he says, yeah, and you'll see me. Zechariah says that, or in fact, Revelation chapter 3 says that when Jesus Christ returns, every eye will see him. Now, some of these UFO religious folks talk about a second coming, but oftentimes the second coming is not the physical return of Jesus Christ, but it's a Christ consciousness that's going to come over the entire planet. So it's something different. And the New Age is like a clever duplication, I think, of what Christians believe as the Great Millennium, or 1,000 years of peace on planet Earth. That's prophesied in the book of Isaiah and discussed widely throughout both the Old and New Testaments. And so, but again, these UFO people, a lot of them warp what the whole idea of the second coming of Christ is. It's a leap into the New Age, is what they say, which is different. And again, I think the idea of the New Age is a clever counterfeit of the millennial kingdom, right? I mean, I don't hope this doesn't sound heretical for those of you that are Christians here, but I'm a New Ager to a certain degree because I believe a new day is coming, right? The book of Isaiah says that everything is going to change after Christ comes back for 1,000 years of peace. The lion will lay down with the lamb. So it's going to have absolute peace during that thousands of years. Jesus, when he approached Jerusalem, wept over it because he said that they don't know their way to peace until the Prince of Peace comes. And so we're going to have a new age, but with the UFO and New Age movement's idea of a new age, or this thousands of years, guess who's not on the throne? And it's Jesus Christ is not on the throne during that time period. So I began to see parallels in my research that almost every biblical passage that had to do with the second coming or even Christ was warped in almost every way. And not only that, they've warped a lot of the ideas that evangelicals would even have about the second coming itself. Let me read something, and again, this is from Brad Steiger. And by the way, a lot of them do acknowledge Jesus Christ, but they don't say that he's God in human flesh. They'll say that he's one of the ascended masters. And this is what Brad Steiger has said about the identity of Jesus. And I don't want to just pick on Brad because he's very typical. He's a mainstream New Ager, and he just quotes what he hears from various conventions. And he identifies Christ as Sananda, okay, which is a big term in New Age circles. And Brad Steiger writes this: Sananda is one of the 7 directors of the spiritual government or hierarchy board of our solar system. Some of Sananda's past incarnations on earth have been Jesus of Nazareth, Moses, Gautama Buddha, Melchizedek, Elijah, and the head of the groups known in the Old Testament as the Abels and the Noahs. Wait a minute, folks. I mean, Jesus was distinctively different than all the people that were mentioned here. Buddha, Melchizedek, entirely different. Moses, Moses was a leader. Jesus was different. So a lot of them have the identity of Christ totally confused. In fact, all of them do. And but let me read something about real quickly about how they tend to believe things different about the second coming itself. I'm looking at my watch here. But during the past couple years, there has been a crossover series of books that have come out. Some of you might have heard of it, and some of you, I'm sure, have read various installments of it, called the Left Behind series, written by Jerry Jenkins and Tim LaHaye. Evangelical books. They talk about the rapture. The idea is that the rapture is coming to planet Earth, and right after that will be the tribulation time period in which the Antichrist will come and things of that nature. And this is kind of like, I would say that most evangelicals would believe in the concept of the rapture, but it's not that simple. There's a lot of traditions within Christianity that really don't see it that way, but yet it is very, very popular. And by the way, in the Christian realm, some of the best sellers really during the past 50 years have been books about Bible prophecy. So it's a real fascinating kind of topic to look into. But I wanted to tell you, as I start reading quotes about the rapture and what New Age people and UFO people call the cleansing, is that what Heaven's Gate did in committing suicide the way they did it was not really out of the mainstream of some UFO cults. If you follow ufology, as I have done, particularly the spiritual elements of it, there are generally 2 large schools of camp. There is like 2 large camps, of thinking about the end times or a future judgment. Most UFO cults and people that are involved, even in the New Age movement, believe there's going to be cataclysmic changes coming on planet Earth in the very, very near future. Okay, and there's 2 agendas that they follow. One will be the UFO evacuation theory. Okay, UFOs are going to come and take us away, and that's what Heaven's Gate thought they were doing. There's the other school, and I'm not quite sure which is bigger. I think they're about the same in size. Maybe some of you would have some definite ideas on this. I can't quite decide. But the other one is that the UFOs are going to come and help us build a new world. And so you have UFO cults all over the world building landing pads. I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious about this, building landing pads, waiting for the UFOs to come to help us build a new age or a new world and things of that nature. So what Heaven's Gate did is that, again, they were known as a bow and peep UFO cult in the 1960s. They kind of went underground for a long time, and then they reemerged as Heaven's Gate under Marshall Applewhite and Betty Truesdale were their two leaders, and she died some time ago. And then at the end, it was Marshall Applewhite who took over the group. But what they had believed is that the aliens were going to come and take them away, okay? And then when tragedy came over planet Earth, a nuclear war or a pole shift and all kinds of destruction, then the UFOs would bring them back and they would help rebuild planet Earth. And so this is a very, very typical scenario that's being played out by a number of UFO cults in the world today. It's rather startling. But the idea is, why I'm going this direction, is that so many UFO cults and UFO theology believes that we're just like Christians would believe, that it's a time of great judgment coming. And this is Brad Steiger again. I'm going to be quoting other people as well. I've quoted him all the time, but I'm going to be quoting others in just a few minutes. But this is what Brad Steiger says about UFOs and the coming time of judgment. Although these paraphysical, multidimensional gods, okay, he claims they're UFOs, and he's using the term gods, little g, although they have always coexisted with us, in the last 30 years, they have been accelerating their interaction with us in preparation for a fast approaching time of transition and transformation. This period, we have been told, will be a difficult one, and for generations our prophets and revelators have been referring to it as the Great Cleansing, Judgment Day, Armageddon. But we have been promised that after a season of cataclysmic changes on the earth plane, a new age consciousness will suffuse the planet. It is to this end that gods have been utilized in the UFO as a transformative symbol. Okay, interesting. Now, another one I'm going to be reading is Alicia Francesca is another one, and she says this. She says, prepare yourself, and this is directly a channeled message she claims she got from her entities. And that she claims they're aliens. Prepare yourself, she said, for the day now closely approaches, and those who are not so prepared must vanish from the face of this your earth. Those who align themselves to the things of the old must surely be destroyed with that age of decay and darkness. So a lot of people that are involved in New Age circles and UFO circles think there might be a great disappearance anyway. That's exactly what Christians believe, except they have it opposite, that the evil people are going to be the ones that disappear. Isn't that startling? And this is mainstream UFO religion, believes in these ideas, a UFO evacuation or things of that nature, or the UFOs coming to help save us from ourselves, pretty much. And to me, that's very, very dangerous. But one of the most dangerous things about it, from my opinion, is that what does New Age religion or UFO religion, what do they think of Jesus Christ? Interesting subject. And I kind of alluded to this, and I'll quote this early article I did, really, in 1988, UFO Cults Are Flourishing in New Age Circles. I was talking about the Whitley Strieber phenomenon there, and I ran into the topic of abductees and contactees and things of that nature. And Whitley Strieber claims to have been an abductee and even a contactee at this point. He's very, very active in UFO circles. But I ran into a man by the name of Stuart Goldman that followed Whitley Strieber around for a couple years and read all of his books. And he wrote a manuscript about Whitley Strieber's experience. And he says this: in looking at the backgrounds of UFO abductees, it quickly becomes clear that almost to a man, they have some background in New Age or occultic beliefs. Interesting. Studies show that there are very few practicing Christians or Jews among UFO contactees. What could this mean? Are the aliens racist? Or does this rather indicate something about the belief systems of the abductees themselves? I think the answer my research has shown has been the second conclusion, that the movers and shakers, I think, in the UFO religious aspect, always dabbled with the occult first, something that the Bible specifically condemned. You know, they, as one of the speakers said during this conference, if you want to see a UFO, they'll make sure you see a UFO, you know. A lot of them are involved in astrology, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and on and on and on. And then the next logical step with UFOs. And we saw this with Shirley MacLaine as well. Eventually it led to UFOs. And so a lot of people get involved with new spirituality, as we now call it, and it'll lead into UFOs and channeling and things of that nature. And by the way, channeling of spirits is specifically condemned in the Bible, I would say about 40 times. Really, it's specifically condemned many, many times, over and over and over again. But getting back to what I was talking about, I don't know of a single evangelical Christian, okay? We're talking about, a lot of people claim to be Christians, but I'm talking about those that really stand on the Bible, God's Word, okay, that have become contactees. And furthermore, I've talked to a number of people, and Joe Jordan has done some research on this, is that many times when people have been abducted, when they call out the name of Jesus Christ, the abduction stops right away. It's rather startling, isn't it? So let me get into an ancient book, the Bible, and let me tell you about a few other things that I saw that really made me take this phenomenon very, very seriously. My style is not to be an evangelical preacher. I was the pastor of a church for 4 years. I mean, I enjoyed preaching. I really feel that my true call was back with writing and things of that nature. I never did give up writing while I was a pastor, but the bigger my church got, the less I began to realize I'd probably never write another book again. I didn't want to do that. But I planted a church, and it's still in existence today. It's part of the Calvary Chapel movement, Calvary Chapel of the Lehigh Valley. But I don't know how many of you are familiar with the biblical text, but the longest discourse really in the Gospels in which Jesus Christ talks about the signs leading to his coming or the end is called the Olivet Discourse. It's found in Matthew 24, Luke chapter 21, Mark chapter 14. But the longest one of these three, and again, they don't contradict each other at all. It's just one might have details in the other doesn't, things of that nature. But it's Matthew 24. The disciples asked Jesus, they're looking at the temple in Jerusalem, which was really one of the wonders of the ancient world, but they were asking Jesus, just look at these buildings and things of that nature. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? And this is Matthew 24, verse 2, and they're talking about the buildings, okay, of Jerusalem. Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. And that happened about 30 years or 40 years after Christ's death on the cross, when Titus Vespasian marched his troops into Jerusalem and literally ripped down the temple. And the stones were massive. It's incredible how that temple was put together. And then it says, and a lot of people lump these together, but I don't think the text warrants that. In verse 3, it says, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives. This implies that they shifted scenes a little bit. The Mount of Olives, and I've been over to Israel, it's right over Jerusalem, and you can look down at the city when you're up there. The disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And it's interesting where Jesus starts. He starts dealing with the end of the age right away. And the first thing he says is in verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, take heed that no one deceives you. Sign number one, the most prominent sign of the end times, is religious deception coming upon planet Earth. Specifically, he says, for many will come in my name, verse 5, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Okay, so religious deception is number one during this time period of the end of the age. And then he talks about, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. Wait a minute, 20th century, right? World War I, World War II, all kinds. The first Gulf War, there was like 39 nations that were allied against Iraq. So nation rising against nation. It talks about earthquakes and famines. And then he says, these are the beginning of sorrows. And then he says, verse 11, okay, this is 6 verses later, he repeats his first warning. And many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. I guess where I'm headed with this talk is the fact that I believe that UFO theology is a great delusion, an incredibly big delusion, because spiritually it heads away from the Judeo-Christian worldview and asserts what I think is an absolute heresy, and that is that there are many ways of God, and Jesus isn't the only way. Okay, and then he goes on talking about persecution coming, and then he repeats it again in verse 23. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. Now, last week, Reverend Moon of the Unification Church declared himself the Messiah. He always did, but he held an official coronation ceremony for himself, calling himself the Messiah, which the Messiah means the Christ. Now, Marshall Applewhite of Heaven's Gate, who did he claim to be, folks? He claimed to be Christ. This Asahara, the guy that, the Japanese cult leader, okay, they bombed the Tokyo subway system, 12 people died in that, and actually what he wanted to do is he was following the scenario of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series of UFO, I mean, they're dealing with aliens and futuristic books, and he thought that if he started Armageddon now, that he could result in saving a lot more lives. But he, in Moscow, declared himself Christ. There's a pattern here. Reverend Jim Jones declared himself Christ. Claude Vorjohan of the Raleigh movement declared himself Christ. And so what I'm trying to say, there's a lot of people, not just cult leaders, but UFO religious people that are warping the idea of Christ, and many of them claim, in fact, to be Jesus Christ. Exactly what the Bible said was going to happen. There's another UFO leader that operates in Alabama. Actually, the guy's in jail right now. His name is Malachi York. The ancient mystical order of Melchizedek, actually, he's in jail for child molestation and things of that nature. He claims he was planted here on planet Earth in 1972 when Bennett's Comet came, and he's actually from another galaxy, is what he said. But he's in jail right now, but he claimed to be the Lamb of God, the absolute Christ on earth. And so this is a pattern, folks, massive religious deception. And in my book, UFO Cults in the New Millennium, I talk about a lot of religious organizations that claim to be Christ, claim to have a leader that claims to be the Christ. Or if they don't claim that, one of the ideas of the New Age is that God is within us, which I think is wrong. I think biblically it's a wrong idea. That's pantheism. That's Hinduism, folks. Okay, the Bible teaches that humankind is separate from creation. Okay, that we will never become Christ. We may live forever someday when we're resurrected and go to heaven, but we will never be in the same level of Christ. And by the way, some of the other religions that wouldn't be considered UFO religions, but Mormonism kind of teaches this too, to a certain degree. Okay, that Jesus Christ they call as our elder brother, and he's Lord over planet Earth. When we die, we'll have our own planet, and we'll be able to rule over that planet as well. So again, I'm not going to go into any rabbit trails about what other religions believe and things of that nature. But what I'm trying to say is that the theology behind UFO religion is diametrically opposed to Christianity. Now I'm going to read a few quotes that UFO people attack Christ's words and his mission. And this is from page 178, a contactee by the name of Reinhold Schmidt. And he said that that through his contacts that he's been told that people should accept universal laws and truths, and that we should get together for a new age in preparation for the coming of the Master. And who was the Master? Well, it wasn't Jesus, Schmidt said. Okay, in fact, it was Sananda. As I wrote in my book here, almost every channeled message from outer space goes out of their way to attack the person, nature, and work of the historical Jesus Christ. Okay, they especially attack Christ's death on the cross 2,000 years ago to save people from their sins. And this counterfeit Jesus that some of them claim to be channeling always attacks Christianity and always claims that the Bible is not reliable. Okay. Now, Winfield Brownell, a channeling session from Jesus, who was in outer space somewhere in November 29, 1978, said that the early church simply taught ethics, a golden rule, but the church later warped his true teaching and claims that that Jesus is going to be getting a new outpouring of his Holy Spirit that will bring in the new age. And then this false Jesus said through channeling that the Bible was wrong in many places and that he didn't die on the cross. Okay, instead, his mission was to show humankind the truth of reincarnation. Now, a lot of New Agers, and I've seen this in UFO literature all the time, always affirm the doctrine of reincarnation. They always say that reincarnation was once in the Bible, but the church warped it and took it out of the Bible. Folks, that is an absolute lie. They even claim various councils, the Council of Constantinople, or several of the councils in which they claim that happened. Folks, we have the record from all those councils. It never happened. There's no rewriting of the Bible. But yet this is believed really by New Age people, UFO people. No rewriting of the Bible. Hebrews 9:27 says that it's appointed unto man to die once and then the judgment. And there's a lot of other passages in both the Old and New Testaments that talk about that as well. In Daniel chapter 12, it talks about how when people die, some will be resurrected to everlasting life and others to judgment. So this is very much a theme of both the Old and New Testament. No rewriting of the Bible ever took place, and this is even laughable from theological circles. I mean, I went to Dallas Seminary for a couple of years, but this is even even know, it's kind of funny that people would make such an absurd claim. But they make claims like this all the time because their theology cannot be propped up or supported by the Bible. So they pretend that it is, and it really isn't in any way, shape, or form. Okay, the last thing, I could say a lot more. I think I'm almost out of time. How many more minutes do I have? About 5, I think. I can take some questions afterwards. Is that right? I go till about noon, I think? Okay. All right, thanks. All right, let me tell you about... Oh, okay, so I'm going to wrap it up real quick, yeah. Okay. Let me just make a few points. Another prominent UFO cult has alleged to take some of the, and he would say that he's not a UFO cultist or runs a religious organization. I would argue with that. A lot of you might have heard of Billy Meyer of Switzerland, right? He's released a lot of UFO photos that look clear, but I think it's obvious that they're fake photos and things of that nature. I'm not going to talk about the evidence there. But he claims that years ago, he claims that he had been in touch with aliens from the Palladian star system, the Seven Sisters and things of that nature. That's kind of what astronomers call it, and things of that nature. And they would pick him up in the UFO, and he called them beam ships and things of that nature, and they would take him different places and show him certain things and teach him certain things. A lot of his teachings were very religious in some of the things that he was saying. Now, he claims that one day an alien summoned him telepathically and told him to be out in a field in Switzerland, and he had something very important to show Billy Meyer. So this spacecraft took him back into time. And right here it is. It's an article. I wrote about this in my 2 articles in the Spiritual Counterfeits Journal. But they took him back into time, okay? And where did they take him? Well, to the 1st century, and these aliens said they wanted him to meet Jesus to find out the true truth of Jesus Christ and who Jesus was. And so his guide was on the spaceship with him, allegedly. His guide's name was Asketh. And he claims that, first of all, Jesus, that really is never his name. And, of course, it wasn't in the Hebrew. I mean, it was Yeshua, but it's been kind of changed, not really changed, but like anglicized into Jesus. But allegedly, this entity who claimed to be Jesus said that his real name was Emmanuel, and he gave him like 5 points, okay, that he should take back to the modern era in the 20th century and proclaim these 5 points to the world. Number 1 was that Judas Iscariot was not a traitor. He was actually his scribe, who he chose to write down the truth about his teachings. Judas was instructed to bury his writings with the hope it would be discovered someday. And by the way, Billy Meyer claims to have dug up this new scroll that gives an alternate reading of the New Testament, an alternate view of the Gospels. And basically, it's like a hodgepodge of New Age beliefs is what it is. And it's been shown to be a fraud and things of that nature. Number 2, Jesus explained that he has never been called Jesus Christ. He claimed that he knows he will be called that because his teaching will be falsely rewritten by others to further the religious aims of the Apostle Paul. Therefore, what will be written in the Bible about him will be, quote, deceitful lies. And so again, all the UFO cults attack the Bible. Almost every one of them do that. I don't know of a single contactee that claims that the aliens transmitted a message to them saying that Jesus Christ died on the cross for the sins of the world. You just don't see that. You don't see it at all, ever. You don't see it. Point number 3, this false Jesus told Billy Meyer that he never died on the cross. Well, as Paul said, without the cross, there's no resurrection, and then therefore you have no hope. Number 4, he denied his virgin birth and told Meyer that his father was a man called Isrich Gabriel, who was apparently trained by the Palladians, trained by the aliens. And number 5, he denied that he was the creator or the Son of God. Now, Jesus most assuredly affirmed himself being the Son of God and even the Creator. In fact, in John chapter 8 and chapter 9, people picked up stones because they wanted to stone him, because he said, before Abraham was, I am. Now, some of you that know about Bible scholarship, what's the I am come from? Well, when Moses went and asked, who should I say sent me? And God says, tell them I am that I am. So Jesus, and this is one of the doctrinal points of Christianity. I mean, Orthodox Christians, and I would affirm this, believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. I mean, even though Jesus was the Son, he was also the Father. I mean, I'm making it very simplistic. Don't ask me to explain the whole doctrine of the Trinity. Maybe Mike can, but I believe that 1 are 3 and 3 are 1. But Jesus was claiming to be the Creator. Before Abraham was, I am. So it's interesting how that went on. But again, I'm quoting these people, their own words, and my books are filled with their quotations of what they're saying and what they really mean about certain things. And to really illustrate a point that I don't think that anyone should be so obsessed with UFO religion, because it's the wrong faith. It'll guide you into the New Age. It'll guide you into Spiritism and all kinds of things condemned in the Bible. And it'll guide you into danger. And part of ufology, I think, is very dangerous. And this is why I really distance myself from some of it, Again, I will probably keep following UFOs until the day I die, but I'm also going to be writing Bible prophecy books. My next book is called Disaster on the Main Line. I'm working on the issue of heresy within the mainline denominations. I write about all kinds of things like that because I don't want to become obsessed with this particular topic. It's also not good for me as a PhD. Some of you have heard this, that some of the people like Mack up at Harvard and David Jacobs of Temple, they've come under a lot of criticism because of so much work on UFOs and things of that nature. In fact, the head of my PhD committee says, Bill, now that you're getting close to getting your doctorate, which I now have, she goes, I don't think it's a good idea for you to write any more books on UFOs. I said, why? She goes, well, you ruin your credibility in this regard. But that doesn't scare me, because my books on UFOs are used in various colleges and things of that nature, because they're so heavily footnoted. And again, I do have a direct reporting approach, and I'll tell you what people are saying, and I won't speculate on things that I'm not sure about either. I just won't do that. I'll just stick with the facts, and I look at it from a sociological method. But what I'm trying to say is that I think that just the... See, if the devil cannot get people to forsake Christ, the devil will get us to waste our time. And in my book, UFOs: The New Age, I call this cosmic tail chasing. And since 1947 to the present, in the modern UFO era, what new do we know about UFOs? It's 2004, folks. Do we know anything about them today? Well, not much more than we knew in 1947. There's still no big consensus what they are. You can go to listen to any expert in UFOs, and there's even at this conference, there's no big agreement over who they are. I think at least the Christian speakers at this conference generally believe that they're tied into the world of the demonic. I believe that. I think the evidence leads there. But they'll waste your time. I know researchers that have spent their whole lives researching UFOs, looking into crop circles, doing all kinds of things, and some of them are getting old now. They really don't have anything to show for it except for chasing this phenomena their whole lives. And they never get any answers for it. Again, cosmic tail chasing. And I think in many ways it's dangerous, not just spiritually, but it's physically dangerous to some people. In my book, I talk about the death of Gloria Lee, December 2nd, 1962. Some of you that study UFOs from a historic perspective know about this story. But in 1962, there's a woman by the name of Gloria Lee that fell into a trance, and she was in contact through telepathy with a space brother that she called JW. Now, I don't know what JW stood for, but JW. And this person, this entity, would keep talking to her, like through telepathy and automatic writing and different things. And she hooked up with a UFO group called the Mark Age Group of Miami. It used to be a real famous UFO organization. And she said that she was told by the space brother that she's supposed to go to the government, go warn the United States government and the Russian government, if she could, to convince it to change its warlike ways. Again, the Cold War was big in that time period and things of that nature. And they instructed her to go to Washington, D.C. to warn the government to change its warlike ways. Now, she identified this being as an etheric being from Jupiter, UFO circles, etheric means spiritual being from Jupiter. So if you look at UFO cults and things of that nature, a lot of them believe in not just physical nuts and bolts beings out there, but they believe that there are spirit beings out there, but nevertheless they're all space brothers. And she gets to Washington, D.C., and this entity orders her on a fast to purify herself for the task. And so the fast she went on, she didn't eat or drink anything for 5 days. It went on for 10 days, and she kept saying, should I keep going? And the entity said, yeah, keep going. She fasted for 66 days, fell into a coma, and died. That's the outworking, I think, of UFO theology. I think it's dangerous to your soul. I think it can be physically dangerous from time to time. And there's been a lot of UFO researchers, and in fact, we've seen some at this conference. I'm not going to cite them. A lot of you haven't been to the whole conference. But there's a lot of evidence that there's physical danger associated with messing around or dabbling with aliens. Okay, with that much said, I mean, there's a lot more I could say about this. As you probably know, I could talk about this all day long. I'll just end it with basically saying that I do think that I know who the aliens are, and I think they're associated with the realm of the demonic. And past centuries, I think people knew this to a certain degree, because UFOs are nothing new and aliens are nothing new. It's just they called them by different names in different centuries, right? Fairies and gnomes, things of that nature. They were always identified with demons. They even had the incubi and succubi that were destructive demons, okay, in the Middle Ages and beyond, that would even get involved with sexual experiments with people and things of that nature. The problem is today is that we think they're all good. They're still little men in most cases, but now they claim to be coming out of flying saucers. And so I'm not here as a preacher to try to win you over and getting saved and things of that nature, although that would be good if you did, but that's not my purpose. I do want you to think through the implications of UFOs and realize that the theology from the UFO movement is diametrically opposed to the Bible, and I do think that they are absolutely demonic, okay? There's a demonic element to little green men or aliens and through contacts and things of that nature, and we know that because the message is diametrically opposed to God's Word, the Bible. And the way they'll lead you is away from Christ. And I think on the basis of that, we can conclude that it's a non-Christian religious system. Okay. Is that, you're asking, is it so bad?
Yes, and that's so bad.
I think it's very, well, Christians would believe that that Jesus is the only way of salvation, right? That's basic Christian doctrine. What's that?
What about the other people who don't believe?
It doesn't matter what other people believe about that. That's what God believes. Okay, therefore it's dangerous.
Can you mention your website for this page?
Yes, my website is a cultlink, one word, cultlink.com. That's an interesting question you raised, though, but that's why, again, as Guy was saying, the conference is open up to all religious views. This is my view on the thing, and to me, this is really bad, because, see, I grieve over people that aren't saved, because if they're not saved, they're not going to receive Jesus Christ their Savior, they're going to go to hell. They're going to be tormented forever, and I believe that. The Bible teaches hell. It doesn't say that it may exist. It teaches it as an absolute truth. So I think that, especially with a great delusion and people are being lost, and I hate when people are lost. Yeah. Yes?
Okay. A lot of Bible prophecy was given to people who received it in things that might be considered, if you didn't cloak it in Christianity, as being channeled. I mean, they got something in a dream from somebody and then they told it. Or John was in a cave and went into a trance and had visions and told it. I mean, if
That's
you take,
not true.
Daniel had a dream and told it. Or a vision, whatever, dream, vision, whatever. So what if you take away your belief system that says that that's okay, what's the difference between that and somebody channeling somebody and telling you?
The question generally is, what's the difference between someone channeling and divine revelation in the Bible, right?
See,
Yeah.
you have to, your worldview is that that's divine revelation.
Okay,
But
the difference between the kind of revelation in the Bible, okay, I'll be more neutral with what I have to say. First of all, John didn't really go into a trance at all. In fact, as he's writing the book of Revelation, he had a voice right out of heaven saying, don't write that. So it was directed revelation. So in many cases, these things weren't really trances. They weren't channeling sessions. You won't find any revelation in the Bible that was similar to a channeling session at all in the modern sense of the term. So that's the difference. And when Jesus talked about the signs of his coming and things of that nature, he didn't channel this. This is just the truth that he had. So it's quite a bit different. Now, my book, I've been to channeling sessions. I've been to a bunch of them. But I went to this guy, I forget his name now. I forget his name. It's in my book in here. But he claims to have been channeling an entity from Jupiter, I think. And Robert Short was his name. And it's like, and someone from the audience was asking this entity, speaking through the guy's voice, of what he should do about his living and what he should change about his life. And the entity spoke through this guy's voice, saying, "Well, you should move 200 miles to the west." And this man was absolutely flabbergasted and say, "How can I do that? That would put me in the middle of the Pacific Ocean." So what I'm trying to say is channeled sessions and channeled messages from today through New Age and UFO circles have been proven not to be reliable. Now, the test of a biblical prophet has been that everything that's going to be said or that's said in the past will take place in the future, or else it becomes false prophecy. So when you deal with, let's just say, the Messiah, prophecies about the Messiah, there were more than 500 distinct prophecies that all of them came true about Jesus Christ, including coming into Jerusalem in a donkey, gambling over his clothing, including where he'd be born, and things of that nature. And so what I'm trying to say is the Bible talks about the devil as a roaring lion seeking to deceive, and Satan that masquerades as an angel of light. You can't trust these channel messages today where you can trust the Bible. It's got a big track record of big dairy area, but in some circles, there's a lot of money to be made from UFOs. But Guy isn't making any money off UFOs, and different people aren't, things of that nature, but there is a lot of money. People are just fascinated by it. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that, and then I'm going to tell you about a number of other things, including from their own words. What are UFOs teaching? Is there an alien agenda? But the first thing I wanted to say, I think, is that, and it has a little bit to do with UFOs being big business. I wanted to put something on the overhead right now. In fact, I will. But this is a famous like woodcut from my field. You know, I'm in the communications field, and so my approach, again, is going to be different than some of the other speakers here today. I'm also coming from, I guess, partly a theological perspective as well, but I'm going to stick, as Guy said, to pretty much straight reporting. But this was a woodcut, and of course, photography really didn't begin in newspapers until the 1920s, and photography really didn't get real well known really until the Civil War. And we don't really have any photos before that time. It's a long time developing of things of that nature. But this woodcut, they used to put in newspapers illustrations. Artists would do things, and they had to engrave it in wood, and then put them on the presses, and then print the newspaper. But this was in probably New York City's most famous newspaper of all time, and it isn't the New York Times. Now it may be, but this was in the New York Sun in 1835. And this is known as a Great Moon Hoax. And this was front page in New York Sun. And basically what this is, and I know it's a little hard to see for some of you, but this is supposedly what an astronomer saw through a brand new telescope in Africa when he fixated the telescope on the moon. And again, it was a hoax all the way. But basically you have people flying around here with bat wings on. He called them bat people. And you have, if you look over here, you see a unicorn. And you find all kinds of strange creatures walking around and pools up there and things of that nature, and then waterfalls. And basically, it was a sensational story. Research Journal in the late 1980s, and I'll show you the article that kind of led to some of this. I was investigating what was known as something new in those days, and they used to call it the New Age movement. And it's not really that sensational anymore. In fact, I would argue that the New Age movement has become the prominent religion of America. You know, more than 50% now of all Americans now believe in reincarnation. A lot of Americans believe in astrology, Ouija boards, tarot cards, and I can go on and on and on. This has become part of contemporary spirituality. And by the way, I reject all those things, but that's not really my topic for the day. But I was doing my news column for the Christian Research Journal, and I went to a festival in New York City. It was the Whole Life Expos. Some of you might be familiar with the Whole Life Expos. They still conduct them all over the United States, and I think in other countries as well. But I was rather astounded in 1987. I think it was 1988. I went to this Whole Life Expo in the Penta Hotel in New York City, and I realized that instead of talking about Shirley MacLaine and crystals and all kinds of weird New Age themes, of which I'd been familiar with for quite some time, about a third of the speakers were talking about UFOs and contact with aliens. And so they were adding to that to their equation. And so I wrote this article, UFO Cults Are Flourishing in New Age Circles. Okay, and again, this is 1988, and the picture in this article is of Whitley Strieber. And 1988 was interesting in some ways because, and this is what I think thrust ufology, rather than New Age, into the mainstream of ufology. In 1987, Whitley Strieber penned this book that it was a surprise bestseller. In fact, it says #1, the controversial New York Times bestseller up here. It was #1 of the New York Times bestseller list for 11 months in 1987. And basically, Whitley Strieber, who is and by the way, I consider Communion a very well-written book. So Whitley Strieber is an extremely gifted writer. And I read it, and it's quite compelling right after this Whole Life Expo convention. But he's a mainstream kind of like a horror writer. Of course, he was very well known before he wrote this book. But this was considered a nonfiction book. A lot of his other books were fiction books. This is considered a nonfiction book because it's his personal story of how he had been a lifelong abductee by aliens. But the rub is, and this is where it became New Age to a certain degree, he didn't call them aliens in the book. And I'm sure some of you have seen Whitley at different conferences and might have read this book. What did he call them? He called them the visitors. And where did he say they came from? Another world? Not necessarily. He said they might have come here on a plane to help humankind go to the next level of our consciousness. And he was one of their apostles that have chosen to talk about a new paradigm, a new religion. And so even the title sounds a little bit religious, doesn't it? Communion. And the idea was they wanted to have communion with humankind. The visitors were coming, and it was a very, very important time in the world, and they wanted us to have communion with them. And so I think it's personally speaking, a very dangerous book, because he basically tells you how to invite these entities, and he repeatedly says he doesn't know who they are and where they're from, and they did all kinds of things to him. They did these operations that we've heard about during this conference, and a lot of you are familiar with that. And they terrorized him. He almost had a nervous breakdown and things of that nature. But yet he tells us in this book to trust them totally. And so the New Age movement did exactly that. Everyone wanted to talk about aliens and UFOs from that point on. And really, ufology, has become a major portion of the New Age movement. Now, in my first book on UFOs in the New Age, I don't have any back at my table right now, but this came out in 1992. I talk about how the history of ufology, how it all developed since the modern era of UFOs began in 1947 when Kenneth Arnold spotted these silver discs flying above him in his private plane near Mount Rainier, Washington. But I also talk about how ufology in many ways has become big business. And of course, you all know what's the major industry arguably here in Roswell. Well, it's flying saucers. That's the major industry here. At least visibly it is. Now, I know it's a
way. My grand pleasure to introduce to you Dr. William, a.k.a. Bill Alnor. Give him a hand.
Thank you, Guy. It's real good to be here. My first experience with Roswell was last year at the conference, and wow, what an experience it is being here. It's amazing. So let me tell you, I'll start a little bit with my background. It's true that I spent much of my life as a journalist, a daily newspaper reporter in the Philadelphia region. But I also have written for much of what we call the evangelical press, Christianity Today, Moody Monthly, publications like that. I was also the news editor for a number of years for a journal called the Christian Research Journal in Southern California that was associated with the late Dr. Walter Martin, one of the 20th century's premier apologists. Now, an apologist is someone who doesn't apologize. That's only part of the topic. But an apologist defends the Christian faith. And so religion has always been a big part of my upbringing. My dad is a Methodist minister, so we would always have in our house all these arguments all the time about why we believe and what we believe and why we do it and things of that nature. And so, but yet I felt that, that I wanted to be a newspaper reporter, and I specifically wanted to write books. And so I'll just tell a little bit more about what I'm doing, but I spent a lot of time, as I said, in the Philadelphia region as a reporter, covering crime news. You know, I did a lot of investigations and things of that nature, and then I started teaching journalism at Temple University in Philadelphia. You know, I'd won a number of press awards and things of that nature, and just with my bachelor's degree, I was teaching journalism courses, you know, basic news writing courses and things of that nature. I didn't get serious about academia really until about 1995, you know, when I realized that, you know, they were asking me to teach more and more courses, and I really like to teach a lot of courses. And so I went to my department and I said, what do I need to do to teach here full time? And they said, you can't, not unless you get your terminal degrees. And so finally I've done it. You know, they put me through the master's degree program in journalism, and then the doctoral program, and then I gravitated down towards Texas A&M in Kingsville, where I direct the journalism program. So I enjoy teaching, but I guess my real passion is writing and research. I think investigative reporting is some of the most important kind of reporting that anyone can do. And during this conference, I've seen fine examples, I think, of some of our speakers doing good investigative reporting, including doing Freedom of Information Act requests and things of that nature. So I've done this in the world of religion. I don't want to be, I know that I'd like to think that I've got a good reputation in the evangelical press, but a lot of people out there don't like me because I dare to do muckraking exposés about Christians as well. So adding aliens to the agenda has been interesting, but I do think that much of what ufology is all about, or how the movement has gravitated, has gone extremely religious. And so a lot of you know that. Some of you that are veterans in the field know that all of a sudden we're talking about all kinds of spiritual things, not just the nuts and bolts ideas of UFOs. A lot of people talk about angels and all kinds of spiritual topics along with UFOs. And so I was the news editor of the Christian Research Journal, writing articles about different alternative religions. And I write, like as Guy said, my website is called cultlink.com. I got involved with the research of religious cults really in the late 1970s when a terrible event happened in Jonestown, Guyana. And of course that was the deaths of 913 people that were basically either shot or drank poison or were injected poison, cyanide specifically, all at the behest of a cult leader. And I began investigating other cult leaders, and so I've written about 500 different articles about religious cults. You know, my work is widely cited in this particular area. Now I got involved again with the Christian